America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Monday, October 10th, 2022. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Claudio Saunt, professor of American history at the University of Georgia, author of Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. Also on the program today, Russia fires missiles striking across Ukrainian city centers in response to the Crimean Bridge explosion. Meanwhile, Arizona appellate court temporarily halts the Arizona abortion ban. Similarly, in Ohio, the 6-week ban paused by a state judge. Senate races around the country hurtling only 25 days away from, I don't know, somewhere around there. Wisconsin Senate race tightens. Polling shows enthusiasm with the Republicans. Meanwhile, Dr. Oz poses with one of Hitler's cars.
Seems like a good idea.
I mean, who knew? Except for the swastika. Literally. Fed still hell-bent on crashing the U.S. and world economies. More Herschel Walker revelations. He urged a second abortion by from that woman who ended up keeping the baby and raising the child without much help from Herschel Walker. And after all that, Joe Manchin's West Virginia's numbers sink. Trump-appointed federal judge rules the Biden administration guidance on LGBTQ protections at work go too far. White House reverses Trump rules and tightens counterterrorism drone strike authorizations. Leaked audio from the LA council members full of racist remarks. And the Biden-Harris task force has now reunited 500 kids with families in Central America, still about 200 to go. All this and more on today's program. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is Indigenous Peoples Day. Some people still refer to it as Columbus Day. It's not a national thing, right? It's just like some states.
That's a good question.
I don't know.
I don't remember, but at the very least, I know people still refer to it as Columbus Day, but we should dispense with that.
Yes.
Get that out of here.
And I should also note that that disembodied voice is Emma Vigeland, who
Oh,
is
yes.
co-host
Hello.
of the program.
I am the narrator for today.
That's right. Hello, Emma.
Hi.
Another week. It is not national, I'm being told, by an IMer. Got a big week ahead of us. I am headed on an airplane tomorrow morning to Las Vegas for what used to be a twice-a-year annual event for 9 years. I think I went in a row, pre-pandemic, to interview some tort lawyers at this conference. I've had some fascinating interviews in the past. I know it sounds odd, but it really is some very interesting interviews. At the very least, I know I'm going to be interviewing one of the attorneys who is involved in one of the lawsuits against Alex Jones, That'll be interesting. But there's others. There's people representing folks from Camp Lejeune, enabled by the legislation that has passed recently. We'll probably do a sort of like a broad strokes interview about the role of tort lawyers in our society, which I think is wildly misunderstood. So it should be interesting. That will be on Thursday and Friday. And Emma will be holding on the ship Tuesday, Wednesday. And on Friday afternoon, I'm hoping, well, it'll be afternoon there, to do just some live commentary on the Herschel Walker Warnock debate.
Oh.
I mean, you can join me if you want, but I mean, it's at 7 p.m. on a Friday night.
On Friday night?
Well, for
From
me,
the hotel room, or where are you going to be doing
I'll probably just be in the hotel room. Yeah.
Wow.
And,
Join Sam's hotel room.
Exactly.
Friday
And
night.
Things are going to be pretty crazy in that room, I can tell
Only
you
Sam's.
that. I mean,
That's only Sam's content.
yeah. That's right. That's right.
I'm gonna pass on coming into work on Friday night to Zoom with you in your hotel room.
I'll be in a... I'll be on a spinning bed, incidentally, while I
It's
do it.
vibrating in the background.
Exactly, spinning bed, and it'll be fully mirrored. I mean, it'll be great.
Okay. Wow.
All right. Speaking of which, Marjorie Taylor Greene showed up at a. I did that.
Segue.
Yeah, thank you. Marjorie Taylor Greene showed up at one of Trump rallies in Nevada. Nevada is a key state in these coming elections. I mean, really, there's really about 8, I think, states that are going to be pretty crucial. Any one of them could provide control to the Republicans in the Senate, or any one or two, I guess. Depends. And Nevada is a big one. Here's Marjorie Taylor Greene going, how can I put this? Full on Nazi. Now, to be fair, she's not wearing a uniform.
Did she say she's a Nazi?
She didn't. But let me know if you've heard of some of these words before. Now, she's not chanting and she's not carrying torches. So maybe, I don't know. But here we go.
Joe Biden's 5 million illegal aliens are on the verge of replacing you, replacing your jobs, and replacing your kids in school. And coming from all over the world, they're also replacing your culture. And that's not great for America.
It's unclear to me what they're all looking at. They're not looking at her. It may be.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, who knows?
They're
what
looking
it
out
is.
for illegals.
Yeah. I mean, they could be.
We could be replaced at any moment.
Now, see, she seems to have a theory that people are going to be replaced by these immigrants, which is, I don't know, it's almost like a replacement theory, if you will.
Wow.
Really, the only level she has left is to say just Jews will not replace us instead
Right.
of you will not replace us.
Right.
And when she says replace our culture, right, she could have been a little bit more explicit and say replace us with black skin or brown skin as opposed to white skin. She didn't say that.
That's true.
Our
That's true.
CrossFit culture.
Right. Just immigrants replacing us. Let's be clear here. When she does say culture, right, she's not complaining about immigrants from, let's say, England or from Europe. Presumably, that's our culture, according to her.
Yeah, what is our culture, right? Because I don't really, from what, CrossFit culture, right? Just Karen culture, I know she's a part of that, but everything...
Loving the cop culture.
Yeah, none of that stuff seems that appealing to me. I don't understand why we want to preserve it. We should replace Marjorie Taylor Greene's culture. I'm in favor of replacing it with something better.
Yes. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. Meanwhile, it is... we're going to take a break in a moment, and we'll be talking to Claudio Saunt, professor of American history at the University of Georgia, author of Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the road to Indian territory. First, a couple words from our sponsors today. One is a company that I actually used both these products, but we've used ZipRecruiter in the past when we've had to hire here at this show, and it was a great experience, frankly. Did you know there are currently over 2.4 million podcasts in the world? Did you know that?
I did not.
It's sort of terrifying. And like I say, it takes a team of people to bring these podcasts together. And we have supplemented, augmented, created this team with the help of ZipRecruiter. Imagine this is where Brendan came from. Brendan led to Bradley. Then we're just only doing BRs now.
Yes.
It's
the chain.
It was just Matt's, and then now it's BR's.
Right, yeah. Exactly. But ZipRecruiter, I think we were advertising for them, and I went ahead and used the service to hire Brendan, and it was really easy to use and incredibly successful. Hiring the right people for these roles on the show, obviously, super important. And it doesn't matter whether you're hiring for a podcast or any other growing business. There's only one place that makes it easier, and that is, again, ZipRecruiter. And now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/majority. ZipRecruiter uses its powerful technology to find and match the right candidates with your job. Additionally, ZipRecruiter has a complete suite of tools that makes it easy to filter, review, and rate your candidates. We got a bunch of people. I interviewed a bunch of people. And organizing things, not my strong suit. I don't know if you've noticed that with my desk. But ZipRecruiter made it really, really easy. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. We did. So if you're a fan of this podcast and you want to try ZipRecruiter for free today, you need to remember our special URL. That is ZipRecruiter.com/majority. Once again, ZipRecruiter.com/majority, MAJORITY. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Also, another product I use, this one daily. It's my Ritual vitamins. Ritual is a company. It was founded by a mom who didn't trust the multivitamins that she was getting out there for her kids, I guess, presumably, and for herself, maybe. And now Ritual has a first-of-a-kind traceable supply chain, so you can see where all of your key ingredients come from and why they are there. Their flagship multivitamin has USP verification and a peer-reviewed and published clinical study. Plus, all of Ritual's products are vegan and non-GMO and third-party tested, so you know you can trust them. Ritual's multivitamins, they were specially formulated to help fill nutrient gaps in the diet. Huge ones in my case. Key ingredients like vitamin D3 and vegan omega-3 DHA, which I understand is good for brain functioning. But the vitamin D I had for a long time, my doctor would always say, you're short on your vitamin D. And that has changed because I've been taking it now regularly. That's one of the other things. Well, I guess I'll get to this. But the beauty is they deliver it to you on a monthly basis. So what used to happen to me was like I would get into a habit. Right. I would take my multivitamin and then I'd run out and then I'd forget about it. And then I'm like, I might as well stop. That's basically what happened to me. I mean, I that's the way I roll. Their delayed release capsule, it is gentle on your stomach. And there's a mint tab in every bottle to keep things fresh. It is a certified, Ritual is a certified B Corporation. Believes doing good for your health means doing good for the planet. And again, delivered straight to your door each month. You will not run out and then basically get out of your habit. I, for one, take the over 50 multivitamin for men because I happen to be over 50.
What?
Just barely. Well, I mean, if you round down for some odd reason, even though we don't do it that way in math. Start a vitamin ritual you can trust. To get started, visit ritual.com/majority today. Get 10% off your first 3 orders. That is ritual.com, ritual.com/majority to start your new ritual today. All right, going to take a quick break. And when we come back, Professor of American History at the University of Georgia, Claudio Saunt, author of Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Claudio Saunt. He is a professor of American history at the University of Georgia and the author of Unworthy Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. This is a history of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Let's just give us the context, because I think this is what, I mean, you know, one of the things that your book does is it basically blows up the idea that this was inevitable. That because what I learned from your book is that things had sort of settled a little bit in the years before. I mean, at least there was some sense that this didn't have to happen, I guess. But give us a sense of like what those first 30 years of the 19th century were like in terms of indigenous people in this country.
Right. So, I mean, dispossession had really started from the very first moment that a colonist set foot on the continent. But you're right in some sense that things had settled, at least that the United States had a working relationship with indigenous nations, and that indigenous nations were experienced in negotiating and dealing with the federal government. So it's striking when you read travel accounts of Europeans visiting Washington, D.C. in the 1820s, that they constantly note is that there were these colorful delegations of indigenous diplomats, ambassadors, in the city. So there were these ongoing relationships, and Native nations thought that there would be a way to hold on to their homelands in the early 19th century. But the other thing I would add is that when this piece of legislation passed in May of 1830, it passed by only 5 votes out of 199 cast in Congress. And this was in a Congress that was overwhelmingly Jacksonian. It was the single most controversial piece of legislation to come before Congress up to that point in time. So when we come up to 1830, Native nations have this longstanding relationship. They think they can work out some sort of compromise. They understand the pressures that they're under. They understand that this is that it's not a just situation, that the compromises they're going to have to make aren't fair ones, but they nonetheless think that they'll be able to hold on to some part of their traditional homelands. And of course, that's not the case, as it turns out.
Let's talk about, well, I guess I want to get to obviously the sort of the impetus. I mean, this is really a big part of the story for the Indian Removal Act, but give us a sense of where we're talking about regionally in the country and the peoples that we're talking about, and just the numbers. And I guess it's also really important to note literally the nature of the soil that they're on.
So there are about 80 to 100,000 Native Americans living within the borders of the United States. And you have to remember, we're talking about 1830, so the United States doesn't extend yet to the Pacific coast. And the populated areas are really east of the Mississippi River. So between 80 and 100,000 indigenous Americans, Some 20,000 of them are living in the Northeast and Great Lakes region, people like the Wyandots, the Oneidas, the Senecas. But the majority of Indigenous Americans are living in the South at this time. And what's striking, if you look at a map of the United States in 1830, is that the heart of the Deep South was still indigenous. It was still Indian country. This is only some 30 years before the outbreak of the Civil War. But fully half of what became the state of Mississippi still belonged to the Choctaws and the Chickasaws. And about a fifth of the state of Alabama, what became the state of Alabama, belonged to the Creeks and the Cherokees. The northern fifth of Georgia still belonged to the Cherokees, and Central Florida still belonged to the Seminoles. And you mentioned the soil, the so-called Black Belt, or the Black Prairie. It's named for the color of this very, very fertile earth that it arcs right through the Creek Nation and passes through the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. This is soil which is ideal for growing cotton. It's very rich in calcium, which cotton takes up in large quantities. And it's some of the most valuable agricultural land in the entire world at this time. So Southern slave owners, planters are eyeing this land greedily and are eager and anxious to dispossess Native peoples for that reason.
I mean, that becomes, I mean, that is, well, I guess there was also sort of a notion, and we can get to Isaac McCoy in a moment, but that becomes the main thrust of what is driving this, I guess, this legislative effort.
That's right. It's a Southern act. Everyone recognizes, and they say it's a Southern act. This would not have passed without the South, and it wouldn't have passed without the state of Georgia, my home state, but without politicians in Georgia pushing for this piece of legislation relentlessly through the late 1920s, and through the passage of the act in May of 1830, it would not have come to pass. So there's a lot of blame to go around. Certainly Andrew Jackson. There are politicians in the North who also sell out and vote for this piece of legislation. But it is really these Southern planter politicians who push forward and make sure that it becomes a national policy.
Talk about the relationship that the relationship between, obviously, I mean, cotton is going to be picked by slaves, and it is plantation owners, but the relationship between the growth of slavery, like, which one's the push and which one's the pull, I guess, is really what I'm asking, in terms of slavery and this expansion. I mean, they sort of go hand in hand, but how much of that was like, we've got all this extra labor capacity, we just need the land, versus we're going to get the land and then we're going to get the extra labor capacity, that of course being slaves. But how did that, what was that dynamic?
Yeah, I think, as you say, they're inseparable, really. And I'm not sure that planters bothered to try to disentangle the two things. But you know, what's driving it is this desire to dominate. And you can read through newspapers and correspondence in the South in the 1820s. What's striking is the arrogance and the desire, they make no bones about it, to create this Southern slave owning empire. And they say, without apology, that they will come to dominate the Union, first of all, if they can only dispossess Native Americans. But they don't stop there, right? If they dispossess Native peoples in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, then they're eyeing land in Texas. And in fact, they want to expand this slave empire all the way to the shores of the Pacific, and they don't stop there. They want to cross the Rio Grande and extend it down into Mexico, and then they They say they want to cross the Caribbean and seize Cuba as well. So they have these grandiose visions of creating this empire that will dominate North America, eventually the entire hemisphere, and in fact, the entire world. And of course, they're going to be sitting right at the top of it, masters of every person in their state, their wives, their children, enslaved people, and masters of every square foot of land. And again, they make no apologies about it. They're proud of this fact.
How much of their desire to sort of expand in this way was also, I mean, you know, we're 30 years out when the Removal Act is passed, but like you say, this is they're pushing for this for, you know, almost a decade beforehand. How much of this was an awareness that we need to get like the clock's ticking on how sustainable this is? Slavery is. I'm just asking if they had a sense that like we're going to create more facts on the ground. The more money we have, the more slaves we have here, the more land we have, the harder it's going to be. Not only are we going to be able to take over the union, but it's going to be that much harder for the union to start to impose like, hey, you know, this slavery thing's getting to be problematic.
I don't believe they think the clock is ticking. In fact, I think it's the opposite, that they think that they are going to create an empire that will last for an eternity. But yeah, it's clear that they're frustrated dealing with the North. They're frustrated that they haven't yet gotten their way. And that's in part why they're so relieved when Andrew Jackson gets into the White House, because he's, of course, one of them. He's a Southerner. He himself is a slave owner, and he has a reputation already for making war against American Indians. So I think they want to seize the moment, certainly, but they're not yet working with the same sort of anxiety or concerns that they are in the late 40s or 1850s, when there's really a sense that, hey, this might not actually work out as we had once envisioned.
Just a quick question. You mentioned Andrew Jackson there, and I think it's hard to, and maybe you'd agree, hard to overstate how much his presence looms in this time period, and how integral like the removal of Native Americans and abuse towards indigenous people was to his rise to power in general. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I mean, as I said, there's a lot of blame to go around. So it's not Andrew Jackson who is responsible for this piece of legislation or this policy, but he's certainly an enabler. I think without him in the White House, it wouldn't have unfolded as it did. But he also sees this as the cornerstone of his administration, and he makes that clear. I mentioned that the legislation had passed by only 5 votes. That was only after Jackson had threatened the political careers of congressmen, twisted their arms, made promises that he didn't keep at the end of the day, but just did everything he could to get this piece of legislation through Congress. So he really thought that this was going to be his great legacy to the United States.
Let's just briefly, and then we'll get into sort of the essence of the legislation and what it did. But talk about Isaac McCoy, because that was sort of I think you describe him as naive, and but he did offer some sort of fig leaf, I think, for maybe those in Congress and in general who had some issues with this legislation.
Fig leaf is a good word for it. So Southern politicians, I think most of them were fairly cynical about all of this and simply wanted the land and wanted to enrich themselves. But they did need some Northern votes to get this through Congress. And so they had to justify the deportation of some 80 to 100,000 people from their traditional homelands. And what they did was to team up with some missionaries, and Isaac McCoy is a particularly prominent Baptist missionary at the time, who has been working out in the Old Northwest in Indiana, and he comes to the conclusion that the only way to save these people, as he sees it, is to, in essence, deport them from their homelands. And so these very cynical planner politicians associate themselves with McCoy and send McCoy to Congress to talk to Northern congressmen and try to convince people that, in fact, this policy, which is based so much in avarice and greed, is the best thing for the people being deported. So
what was the argument? Like they don't, the soil's too fertile for them.
Right. So the argument is that Native peoples are disappearing, that they will vanish from the face of the earth if we don't do something about it. And they looked back at the longer history, demographic history in North America. And yeah, it's true that the indigenous population had plummeted. But in fact, if we look at the best evidence available to us today, it appears that the population within the United States, the indigenous population, was stable, if not growing, in the early 19th century. But there was so much disinformation that was circulating in the newspapers that it was impossible for Native peoples to get this out, no matter how much they complained and protested. And they did. Over and over again, they said, it's not the case that we are in such dire circumstances. It's not the case that our population is dwindling. It may be small, and our numbers may be smaller than they used to be, but we are a stable, if not thriving community, and we want to stay where we are. But they simply couldn't break through all of this propaganda that was being planted in northern newspapers.
How much, and I would imagine, because there was no close proximity, it was not observable for Northerners. Obviously, they were more susceptible to that type of misinformation. How much was there in the southern states attempts to create friction in support of that premise?
That's one of the awful things about this story, reading through it and reading the sources, is that white Southerners, with the support of state officials and with the support of the federal government, made the situation untenable for Indigenous Americans in their homeland. So they were faced with this choice, right? They could stay where they were on the lands that they knew and that their grandparents and great-grandparents had farmed. And if they did, they faced starvation, literally. And you can read through these sources. The descriptions are horrific of what people like the Creek Indians faced in the early 1830s when they were peeling bark off trees to eat it to try to sustain themselves. So they're faced with that. They can stay in their homelands and face starvation, or they can take this chance by walking hundreds of miles to the west through hostile communities to lands that they didn't know.
Where did the starvation was a function of what?
The starvation was a result of these southern states extending their state laws over indigenous nations, and then not permitting Native peoples to testify in state courts against white people, which is in essence a license for white people to move onto Indian lands and run them off their farms.
So that's what was going on, was that they were basically literally, like, the food was stolen from them.
They were literally running them off their farms. I remember one story, a Choctaw woman who said she was living in her house until a white man moved nearby, plowed the area right around her house, right up to the front door, and then began prying the siding off of her house as she was living in it. So she abandoned the house and had to move. There are numerous stories or people, elderly folks who were farming their lands. A white man would show up and then beat them with a whip until they had to leave the property. So yeah, they were literally run off at gunpoint.
Let's talk about the law passes, and you argue that this is unprecedented in terms of we have other examples of expulsions in history prior to this. But what was unprecedented about this? Was it the scope, or just sort of the mechanism, or the planning? And because obviously it's expulsion when somebody starts to pry the siding off your house, but it's the sort of like it's a state machinery that is doing this at this point.
Right. So these sorts of state-sponsored deportations or mass deportations, they do go back thousands of years. What's unprecedented about this one is just how systematic it is, just how bureaucratic it is. Because the United States dreams up this policy that they're going to move every single person. And then it's not that they're run off. It's not that an army marches in and everybody flees. It's that they send out census takers and Indian agents, as they were called, to record everybody's name and to describe their property in detail, down to the number of windows in each cabin. So there's this state bureaucracy. Now, from our perspective today, it's minuscule. But back in the early 19th century, this was something new, that they were going to turn this into a kind of bureaucratic process. And because it was so bureaucratic, the state administrators thought that it was just, that somehow this was going to become a model for other nations around the world about how to treat populations justly.
Was that the point? Because as you know, you're describing we're going to take census and we're going to write their names down and we're going to put their, how many windows. Was it simply basically to make it seem like it was a more civilized act?
I think
but what would they do with that information at that point? Like, okay, now we have it on the sheet, and now we're going to put you on the Trail of Tears, and you may or may not make it. But if you do, we'll know that you were here. What's the value of that?
Yeah, in many cases, the value was to not waste money. The person who oversaw the operation was the Commissary General of Subsistence. He's really a kind of glorified accountant in the War Department, as it was then called. And he monitored federal expenses that went towards feeding, in normal times, soldiers in the U.S. Army. Now he was suddenly tasked with monitoring federal expenses directed at deporting people. So every single penny, in fact, down to the fraction of a penny, literally had to be accounted for. And so all of these records are now in the National Archives. And if you go to the records in the Treasury Department of the Second Auditor's Office, there are just thousands and thousands of pages of receipts documenting how much money had been spent on this operation. But over and over again, the Commissary General, George Gibson, says, don't spend more than you need to. This or that is a wasted expense. I can't reimburse you for that. We need not to waste the public's money. So there's that part of it. At other times, some of the records are produced as a result of specific stipulations in some of the treaties that they had signed with Indian peoples. So Americans in the 1830s, they're living in this republic, and they're very conscious that it's a republic, and they are very conscious that their republic is going to be and is going to be different from the corrupt, tyrannical empires in Europe. And so I think that's also part of it, that here, this is how we do it in a republic. We send out administrators, and this will unfold according to the way that a civilized republican government conducts such operations.
Well, two things that strike me. One is that it would make reparations much easier, at least in terms of, like, we have the records. It wouldn't be that hard to sort of update the value of that land and any type of other compensation beyond that. A, and B, they ended up though spending, I don't even know the multiples of how many times, like 75 times more than they had initially allotted, right? I mean, it was almost like $1 trillion in today's dollars.
Right. Well, to get the act through Congress, I mean, it works the same way today. They underestimate the cost, and the actual piece of legislation appropriated $500,000 to move 80 to 100,000 people. I mean, it was absurdly small, and I think almost everybody understood that at the time. And then, of course, none of it unfolded according to the promises that Southern politicians had made to the public. And eventually, the United States has to fight a couple of wars to move people, because, of course, they're not going to cooperate with their own deportation. So they have to send troops into the Creek Nation in 1836. And then even more costly is they have to fight a war against the Seminoles, which rages from 1835 to 1842. It's extraordinarily costly in both lives and dollars, and it's mostly fought for naught, because it's not even land at the time. Florida is not considered to be particularly valuable land. It's swamps and marshes. But here they are pursuing these refugee families down to the tip of the Florida Peninsula, to try to round them up and deport them to Indian territory. And a lot of Americans recognize at the time that this is just it's an unjust war and it's a fiasco, but they continue to fight it nonetheless.
So explain to me, there was an 1832 Supreme Court ruling. What were the implications of that ruling? Just tell us what the ruling was and what the implications of it were, and about the timing. Seems of that as opposed to it happening before 1830. Talk about that.
So I mentioned that the southern states had extended their laws over Indian nations, which were sovereign entities, sovereign nations, just like the United States. So the Cherokee Nation sued, and there was one case in 1831 in which it was determined that the Cherokee Nation didn't have standing, and then there was a second case, the one you referred to, Worcester v. Georgia, in 1832, that hinged on this very question: did the state of Georgia have the right to extend its laws over the Cherokee Nation? The ruling, in fact, came down as a victory for the Cherokees, and there were celebrations the day that it was in the Cherokee Nation, the day that it was handed down. It was this tremendous victory when the Supreme Court said that no, this was not permissible. Andrew Jackson, however, did not enforce this ruling. At the end of the day, it didn't matter. Georgia ignored the ruling. It still sent its troops and federal, or rather state militia, into the Cherokee Nation. And it just pretended as if the ruling had never existed.
talk about the financiers in the North who, I mean, you know, and we've had many historians who have come on and talk about the relationship between northern industry and finance and cotton, and that symbiotic relationship. There was one, a similar one with this removal as well.
Yeah, it was one of the things that really surprised me when I started digging into this story, because we think of it largely as a Southern story, and we think about it largely as a kind of political story. But in fact, to my surprise, Wall Street was deeply involved because these financiers recognized immediately that this was a rare opportunity to make tremendous profits, right? Some of the most valuable agricultural lands in the entire world were suddenly, millions of acres of land were suddenly becoming available, were being thrown onto the market. And so these financiers, all of the leading financiers in New York and Philadelphia and Boston formed these joint stock companies, pulled their capital, and flooded the South with money, buying this land from Indigenous Americans. And that's a whole other ugly story we can go into, but really kind of cheating Native peoples out of their lands, and then turning around and making and reselling that land to planters and making profits of 300, 400, 500, sometimes even 1,000%. So you can read through their correspondence, and they're kind of marveling at just the opportunity that is once in a lifetime or once in a millennium, they were saying to each other, to make just a tremendous amount of money. What was even more surprising to me is that there are these connections to Wall Street, but investors in Europe get involved as well and put their money into dispossessing Native peoples.
How much were they? I mean, I got to imagine that some of these financiers were aware that, like, you know, in the 1920s, that this could be a boon, and that they did you find evidence that they were also lobbying their northern counterparts in terms of Congress? Because this, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I guess, like, I mean, the entire story, it seems to me, of the dispossession of Indigenous people was always about money and resources, it seems to me. I mean, I'm sure there were political elements, you know, that were, but it was always the primary force for all of this has been essentially capitalism.
Absolutely, but it is these Southern politicians who are making the push, and I think that's why we had for so long thought of this as a Southern story. But as you say, I mean, it's only in the last generation that we really have historians have started to recognize just how deeply embedded these connections were between Northern finance and Southern slavery. And so this is just kind of a further extension of that, they're also investing deeply in the dispossession of Native peoples.
And it also ends up on a political level, it provides that support. Right. I mean, if everybody, if you're getting different elements from across the country who are invested in this, literally, then you're also part of their buy-in is their political power.
Yeah. And so the lobbying that I found was less on the political legislative side, although I do wonder if there's not more to be learned about that, and more on the kind of back end lobbying with the Treasury Department, so Wall Street banks trying to fight to issue have the right to issue bonds or buy bonds on behalf of X, Y, and Z, or have the right to purchase Indian lands, trying to get the federal government to sign off on the purchases. So these kinds of back-end inside dealing in order to turn a profit at the expense of Native Americans.
So we start in 1830, 100,000 or so indigenous people in almost like a dozen tribes, maybe more, I guess. And how many are actually expelled from their land and make it to Oklahoma, I guess?
So almost all of them. And there are numerous federally recognized nations still in the United States east of the Mississippi River. In fact, even in the South, we still, there's the Eastern Band of Cherokees still in North Carolina today, and there are Seminoles, as we know, still in Florida. There's the Mississippi Choctaws. So some did manage to stay, but these were very, very small numbers in the 19th century, and numbering in the hundreds. And meanwhile, some 80,000 people had been rounded up and deported. So from the perspective of these Southern planters and federal politicians, it's a successful operation.
And what do we see to the size of slavery that sort of what happens to the numbers of slaves between 1830 and 1865, I guess, or 1860?
It's astonishing to see just how rapidly these lands were transformed. So these people are deported over the course of the 1830s. Within the space of a decade, 10 years, the lands have been clear cut. There are descriptions of the orchards that Native peoples, they had expansive peach and apple orchards with ancient trees, and these were all cut down and replaced with cotton, and tens, in fact, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were moved onto these lands. So by 1850, when you look at it, I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but some huge percentage of the cotton crop in Mississippi was being produced on lands that only 10 years earlier were owned by Choctaws and Chickasaws. And some extraordinarily large percentage of enslaved people were laboring on those lands. So it's really just an incredible transformation in the space of just a few years, which changes the way the Deep South looks. And again, it's so striking when you think of, I think when most of us think about the Deep South and places like Mississippi and Alabama, for good reason, we think about sprawling slave plantations, we think about the Civil War, but 30 years before the outbreak of the war, this is still Indian country.
I mean, just the enormous amount of profits that must have been made throughout that entire process, right? The purchasing, the financing of the land, then the resale of the land, I guess, and then the financing that's involved in all the ships coming over with, the slave ships, and then the financing the cotton. I mean, it's just huge numbers of dollars. I mean, it's just like full on extraction that almost like fed another round of extraction that it was really sort of mind boggling.
Yeah, it's not a side story to American history. And I think that's how for too long we've thought about Indian removal and the Trail of Tears as a kind of unfortunate event in American history. It's unfortunate. It's more than unfortunate, though. It is central to understanding 19th century American history and to the development of the economy and to the expansion of slavery across the South, and eventually is central to the outbreak of the Civil War. It really does transform the Southern economy and the national economy more generally. So millions of dollars, certainly. But you can flip that around too, and just see how much Native peoples lost, and how that impoverishment resounded through multiple generations. I mean, they lost everything almost overnight, and you can kind of imagine if your inheritance, your multi-generational inheritance, were taken from you with a single piece of legislation, just how the consequences would resound across multiple generations.
Yeah, it really is amazing because, like I said too, that we've talked to many historians about the what cotton and essentially the extraction of that labor from slaves, generating this economic juggernaut that America is becoming at that time. And this is sort of almost like the match that lit that sort of fuse, I guess.
It is. I mean, obviously, slavery was already deeply rooted in other parts of the country, but when cotton becomes king in the first 4 decades of the 19th century, it's on indigenous land, and it's on land that was taken just a few years before.
It's a fascinating story. The book is Unworthy: Republic, the Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Claudio Saunt, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, folks, I'm going to head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will
have fun.
Fun Day Monday.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Did I just coin that, or have we said that before?
I
think we've said it before.
Yeah,
I feel like we've said that before. I knew I heard it somewhere.
Yeah.
Folks, just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member by going to jointhemajorityreport.com, and you can do that today. And what will happen is you'll get the free show, free of commercials, and then you get the fun half. Sometimes free of fun, but often
we'll have fun today.
Often fun.
We have Kanye. We've got
a lot of insanity going on. We will also give you an update on some of these races around the country. Also, don't forget, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY, get 10% off. Emma, it is Monday, and that means that yesterday was Sunday.
That's true.
And that means that there was football going on.
Yes. The Giants are 4-1. The Jets are 3-2. So Bradley and I are going to be in a happy mood at 4 p.m., but we're also going to talk about the first firing of the head coaching carousel in this NFL season. Matt Rule is out this morning as the Panthers head coach. Plus, is Micah Parsons the defensive player of the year? I would say yes, and more on ESPN here on the Majority Report at 4 p.m. Plus, Dave Zyron's going to be joining us, and he will talk about his latest project covering the NFL as well. So check it out. Yeah, and maybe we'll also touch on the Mets collapse as well. YouTube.com/ESVN show, and then also subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate us 5 stars, all that good stuff.
Matt, what's happening in the Matt Leckian media universe?
Over the weekend we talked to Gene Bajlan about the protests in Iran and how everything isn't a CIA color revolution. Tomorrow we'll have the boys from Brigham Young Money podcast talk about Utah. But we won't be live on YouTube because I got us suspended from YouTube for a week because because of we got our second strike on COVID policy stuff.
What?
It's pretty ridiculous.
What are you talking about?
Well, this time we had a conversation like a month or so ago with Dr. Eric Osgood to talk about a lot of different things.
Just because you had Malone on?
just because I said I felt digital today. No, but we did talk about like what is in. We talked about long COVID and stuff like that, but we also talked about vaccine harms, and I think While we said definitively the results are in, get the vaccine, we talked about what people are seeing and like vaccine harms throughout history and things like that. And I think that got us our second strike.
That's nuts.
Stuff. So it is, they're definitely like over policing it. Russell Brand also got the exact same strike. I don't think this is going to be as lucrative.
Well, he got the same strike because, and then he
was saying, "Oh yeah,"
and then he issued a correction.
Yeah,
that got far fewer views. They just took down the offending content.
Yeah,
did they pull down your content?
They pulled down the content too. So both those are gone. So if you want to make David Griscom feel a little bit better today, patreon.com/leftreckoning, a good day to join our Patreon. But yeah, so we won't be live tomorrow on YouTube. We'll go live on Twitch and stuff like that.
I mean, you've been canceled. This is the thing.
This is censorship, and it's clearly just Fauci trying to. I don't want to get this censored by being satirical. So no, yeah.
This is a joke.
Yes.
Everything you hear will be a joke. Wow, that's messed up.
Yeah.
Melon,
we'll have a show.
2 IMs. One is from your left testicle. Tribal citizen here. I appreciate you having Claudio on today. The impact of this still affects my family today. How could it not? How could it not?
Yeah.
Melancholy says, please help me win an argument with my know-it-all husband. I was telling him that just-in-time inventory was used to strip labor of power in negotiations and strikes, something that I learned from the Majority Report. He scoffed at that. Do you remember that discussion? Could you explain the logic, or were you talking with McAlevey or someone else? I think what you're referring to is a switch that actually the auto industry did from a just-in-time inventory system that the Japanese ended up copying, but they switched it because they wanted to disempower labor. That was from that book Wrecked, which I can't remember what how the automobile industry destroyed itself or something. I can't remember that. We did quite some time ago. Just in time also, it is just in time, like not necessarily inventory, but work, where you have people who are on call all the time, is one of the things that labor's fighting for. But check out that interview, Wrecked. It is fascinating. And I hope you win your argument with your husband. All right. See you in the fun half. 646-257. What is it? 65. What is it?
646-257-3920.
Yes, thank you. I'm not having a stroke. All right, we'll be right back. 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, and I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now, and I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now, but I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow. What? What is that going on? It's nuts. Wait a second. Hold on for a second.
The Majority Report.
Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone?
Nomi Key.
You did it. Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false.
No, I'm sorry. Women's...
Stop talking for a second and let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude, you want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? Is it?
Yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello? Is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day.